My parents want to choose my baby's future. But what about my own? Lily was an ordinary teenager. A 16-year-old who loved art, was planning for her future, and looked forward to summer days with her friends. But then life took an unexpected turn. She hadn't expected to find herself in a life-altering dilemma. Yet here she was, facing something no one could have prepared her for. Lily had been working at a local diner part-time, a small job she'd taken to save for college and gain some independence. It was here she met Jake, an 18-year-old coworker. Charismatic and funny, he was the kind of person everyone noticed when he entered a room. And for someone as reserved as Lily, his attention made her feel special. Jake was about to graduate, with plans to enlist in the military. And although they weren't dating, Lily often wished they could be more than friends. She admired his confidence, his bold plans, his dreams of traveling and serving, but she always knew he didn't see her as a serious partner. He was charming, and there were others who had his attention. But for Lily, he was her first crush, her first connection, and eventually, her first love. One night, things changed between them. It wasn't forced, but it was a moment Lily hadn't fully thought through. She was in love, young, and naive. The possibility of consequences felt distant, almost unreal. But a few weeks later, when she started to feel the first signs of pregnancy, her world shifted in ways she never imagined. After taking the test, she sat in stunned silence, heart pounding as she tried to process the reality. Her parents were furious when they found out, accusing her of irresponsible decisions, and shaming her for being so careless. For Lily, the shame was already deep. She had loved Jake, in her own way, and now she felt rejected, alone, and overwhelmed. Jake's response was pragmatic, almost indifferent. He said he would support whatever decision she made, but he didn't want to tie her down. He was on the brink of a new life, ready to leave town for basic training, and the idea of a child was an unwanted distraction. Lily wished for his warmth, his understanding, but she got distance and practicality instead. She felt foolish, naive for ever thinking he'd care enough to stay. And as she sat alone in her room that night, feeling the weight of his detachment, the isolation closed in. She felt that every choice she'd made was now pulling her further from the person she wanted to be. Her parents took control quickly, insisting that the only reasonable choice was adoption. Her mother would say, "This will ruin your life. We aren't raising a child for you, and we won't let you throw your future away." They arranged meetings with adoption agencies and began reviewing family profiles. But Lily wasn't ready to consider this option. She wanted to see her baby, to hold him, to give him the love she hadn't felt herself in so long. She wanted a chance to be a mother. Despite the impossibility of it all, Lily felt like she was in a whirlwind. Between doctor's visits, school assignments, and the silence from Jake, her days became a blur. She'd spend her nights awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining her future and the reality that awaited her. Sometimes, she'd feel a gentle movement within her belly, reminding her that her life had changed forever. In those quiet moments, her resolve would grow stronger. Her fear mixed with love as she envisioned what it might be like to have this baby in her arms, to raise him with every ounce of care she could muster. She reached out online, hoping to connect with others who'd gone through similar experiences. She found forums where young mothers shared their stories, of struggles, of triumphs, of loss. One story resonated deeply. A woman who had been forced to give her baby up for adoption and later spent years wondering where her child was. If they were loved, if they knew she cared. That fear of regret, of wondering, what if, gnawed at Lily, making her hesitant about her parents' plan. The thought of one day seeing her child in a grocery store, only to have them pass her by without recognition, filled her with dread. Could she handle the heartache of letting go? Jake's family offered to help in a limited way. His parents were sympathetic, offering their home if Lily chose to keep the baby. They promised her they'd do their best to support her. Although they shared concerns about Jake's future, Lily wasn't sure she could live with them, nor did she want to be a burden. But it was the first glimmer of support she had felt in months. She attended a meeting with an adoption counselor, who explained the process, showed her family profiles, and suggested ways she could be involved in her child's future even if she chose adoption. The counselor was kind, understanding her apprehension, but as Lily looked at the profiles, each smiling face of prospective parents seemed hollow. Her heart twisted. torn between wanting a better life for her baby and a deep yearning to keep him close. The counselor suggested that if Lily chose to proceed with adoption, she could opt for an open adoption, where she could maintain some level of contact, watch her child grow, and perhaps have occasional visits. This eased her mind, but only slightly. The thought of letting someone else raise her baby, even with the promise of updates and photos, still felt unbearable. Each profile, each smile, seemed like a judgment on her inability to provide the same happiness herself. As the pregnancy progressed, Lily felt more and more disconnected from her family. She overheard her mother on the phone with a friend, talking about the adoption as if it were a simple transaction, a problem to be solved. Her father would sigh whenever the topic came up, exasperated by what he saw as an unnecessary disruption. They wanted to get back to normal, and they saw the adoption as a way to sweep everything under the rug. For Lily, this was not a bump in the road, it was her whole life. Her parents were blind to her feelings, dismissing her love for the baby as a childish impulse, something she'd outgrow. But Lily knew her feelings weren't fleeting. She was connected to this new life inside her in ways they couldn't understand. She began journaling, writing letters to her baby, expressing her love, her fears, her hopes. She wanted him to know her, to know that she was fighting for him, even if no one else could see it. The days wore on, and Lily faced increasingly intense pressure. Her parents grew frustrated with her hesitation, and even Jake grew distant, his texts dwindling until they stopped altogether. She felt as if her world was shrinking, as if everyone was moving on while she was trapped in her own private torment. The pain of choosing between her family's wishes and her heart's desire became overwhelming. And she found herself walking the town streets at night, hoping the fresh air would clear her mind. On one of these walks, she encountered a woman pushing a stroller, a young mother who looked tired but content. Lily watched from afar as the woman played with her child, laughing softly as the baby reached up to touch her face. In that moment, Lily saw a reflection of the life she wanted, hard but full of love. She imagined herself with her own baby, growing together, finding joy despite the hardships. It was an image that gave her hope. As her due date approached, the gravity of her choice became inescapable. The love she felt for her child was indescribable, but so was the fear. Could she give him a good life on her own? Could she bear the heartache of letting him go? Her parents insisted they were doing what was best, but Lily was beginning to see that the only person who could make this choice was her. In the end, Lily's story is a reflection of the countless young people who face impossible choices. For Lily, the path forward was unclear, filled with doubts and heartbreak, but also with strength she never knew she had. She had to find her voice, to stand for what she believed in, even if it meant facing her family's disapproval, even if it meant walking a path alone. On the edge of love and fear, my journey to rediscover self-respect. Have you ever found yourself wondering if the person you love truly understands you? At first, everything felt perfect. Nicole was magnetic, confident, adventurous, and with a sharp wit that drew me in from the start. She was older than me, and I admired her independence, the way she seemed to own herself and her choices so fully. We shared so much, our love for hiking, movies, and cooking. But she had this one fascination, a passion for something I could never truly relate to: knives. At the start, I barely noticed it, a few survival tools here and there, tucked away in her camping gear. It felt normal, but soon, her interest became something more, an obsession. She started carrying different knives and practicing tricks. I remember the first time I saw her spin a knife between her fingers. Her eyes focused with an intensity that was almost unsettling. She even joked, "One day, I'll make you a knife master too." I chuckled, brushing it off, even though my stomach twisted a little. You see, knives had always terrified me. I had a bad experience with them as a kid, something that left me with a deep-rooted fear. For years, I avoided situations where knives were involved, even simple things like cooking around people. When I met Nicole, I opened up about it. I thought she understood, but maybe she never really did. She laughed it off, insisting that her fascination was just a hobby, and told me I'd eventually get over it. I tried to play it cool, convincing myself I was overreacting, but her obsession grew. She started bringing out new knives to show me, twirling them around like a performer, even while we watched movies or sat around talking. At first, I just asked her to stop. She brushed it off with, "It's just a knife. Don't worry about it." And I wanted to believe her. I really did. I wanted to think she'd stop if she knew how much it bothered me. Then came Halloween. We both loved Halloween, decorating the house, throwing parties, watching scary movies. But that year, Nicole decided to take things further. It started innocently enough. She asked me to come into the kitchen to help with decorations. When I walked in, I saw her playing with her knife, doing her usual tricks. Suddenly, she gasped, clutching her hand. Red liquid spilled down her fingers, pooling on the counter, staining everything around it. My heart stopped. Everything in me froze. The memories hit like a tidal wave, dragging me back to that childhood trauma I'd worked so hard to move past. I felt my pulse racing, my breath catching, and a strange numbness took over. I barely remember what happened next. I think I started shouting, looking for something to stop the bleeding, and dialing 911 in a frenzy. Just as the operator answered, I heard her laugh. "Gotcha," she said, grinning, holding up her hand to reveal the fake blood and a sliced carrot she had used to create the effect. She was laughing like it was the best joke in the world. "You really need to get over this knife thing," she teased, shaking her head. "It's Halloween. It was supposed to be fun." I remember feeling this strange emptiness, like my heart had left my body. I couldn't even find the words to respond. I just grabbed my keys and left. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, trying to breathe, trying to calm down. My phone kept buzzing, texts from Nicole, apologies mixed with excuses. "It was just a joke. I didn't think you'd react so badly. It's not that big of a deal." For days, I barely responded. Part of me kept wondering if I was overreacting, like she said, but another part, the deeper, quieter part of me, was screaming that this wasn't okay. I thought back to all the times I'd told her about my trauma, about the way knives made me feel, and every time, she'd brushed it off, almost like she thought it wasn't real. Finally, I agreed to meet with her, thinking we could talk it out. But when I walked into her apartment, she greeted me with sarcasm. "Oh, so you finally decided to grace me with your presence?" she said, crossing her arms. Her tone was sharp, defensive. I tried to explain how I felt, how her prank had affected me, but she dismissed it all. She even accused me of being too sensitive, insisting that I should get over my fear if I wanted our relationship to work. I felt myself getting smaller with every word she spoke, like I was somehow wrong for feeling the way I did. She tossed a few knives into the sink dramatically, sneering as I flinched. "See, this is why it's so hard to be with you," she said, her voice filled with exasperation. "I have to walk on eggshells just because you can't handle a joke." I tried to hold my ground, tried to tell her that this wasn't okay, but she just laughed, shaking her head like I was the unreasonable one. As the days went on, she continued to alternate between apologies and mocking. One minute she'd say, "I'm sorry, I didn't know it was that serious." And the next, she'd be rolling her eyes, telling me to man up. She started bringing up little things that I didn't even realize bothered her, using them as ammunition to make me feel even worse. I felt like I was constantly walking on a tightrope, never knowing what would set her off. I started doubting myself, wondering if maybe she was right. Maybe I was being unreasonable. Maybe my fear was irrational, and I was just being weak. But every time I thought about that Halloween night, about the way she laughed at my fear, I felt that pit in my stomach all over again. Eventually, I reached a breaking point. It wasn't just about the prank anymore. It was about respect, about boundaries, about knowing that I deserved to feel safe in my own relationship. I confided in a close friend, who encouraged me to see the situation for what it was, toxic. I had tried so hard to make things work, to see the best in her, but I was sacrificing my own mental health in the process. The decision to leave wasn't easy. I kept thinking about the good times, about the laughter and the connection we once had, but I knew deep down that staying would only hurt me more. With the support of my friend, I gathered the courage to end things. When I told her I was leaving, her reaction was a mix of shock and anger. She accused me of being selfish, of throwing away everything we had over one little joke. She tried to guilt me, even hinted that she might harm herself if I left. But I stood my ground, knowing that this was something I had to do for my own peace of mind. Looking back, I see now that this relationship taught me some of the hardest but most valuable lessons of my life. I learned that love should never come at the cost of my own mental health, my own boundaries, or my own sense of self-respect. Love should feel safe, nurturing, and supportive, not like a battlefield where you're constantly defending your own worth. I realized that my fear of knives, my trauma, was valid. It was a part of me that deserved understanding and compassion, not mockery or dismissal. True love doesn't ask you to change the core of who you are just to make someone else comfortable. In the end, walking away was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was also one of the most liberating. I'm sharing this story not just for myself but for anyone out there who might be struggling with a relationship that doesn't feel quite right. If there's one thing I hope you take away from my story, it's this: you deserve love that respects your boundaries, that values your feelings, and that supports your healing. You deserve a partner who sees your scars and holds them with care, who understands that trauma isn't something you can just get over because someone else thinks you should. Don't let anyone make you feel small for feeling deeply, for having fears, for wanting to be treated with respect. In the end, real love is about acceptance. It's about two people who lift each other up, who create a safe space where both can be vulnerable, honest, and whole. And if that love isn't there, if respect and kindness aren't at the foundation, then maybe it's time to choose yourself, to walk away, and to find the peace you truly deserve. As for me, I'm still healing, but for the first time in a long time, I feel free. The price of honesty when truth breaks a friendship. It was barely dawn when my phone buzzed. I rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of the time. 5:30 a.m. My friend Sam's name flashed on the screen, and I groggily answered, wondering what could be so urgent. His voice was a blend of hesitation and urgency. This wasn't a typical, "I need advice" call. Sam's words tumbled out, and I could sense that something big was weighing on him. "Do you think I should finally tell my family the truth?" he asked. Breaking the silence, my half-asleep mind took a moment to process his question. Sam was transgender, transitioning from female to male, but almost no one in his family knew. For years, he'd kept it hidden, especially from his conservative, homophobic family. The topic wasn't new, he'd talked about it off and on, but never with this sense of immediacy. I took a breath, aware of the gravity of his question. "Sam," I said carefully, "I think you should consider what you'd be giving up if you told them now." You see, Sam's grandfather was wealthy, very wealthy. Sam had seen the will and knew he stood to inherit a considerable amount of money. Over $2 million, but there was an unspoken condition: his family would disown him if he came out. Sam had talked about it before, and he knew the stakes. His family was openly homophobic. Each time I'd been to their house, one of them would launch into some hateful rant. It was awkward and exhausting, but it showed me exactly how his family would react if they knew his truth. Yet, here he was, questioning if he could keep up the lie. I knew Sam had been struggling with this, especially as he grew more comfortable in his own identity. In college, he had started dressing more androgynously, his hair shorter, a step closer to his authentic self. But I also knew the implications. If he came out, he could lose everything that his family had promised. So, I was honest. "You'd lose the inheritance, Sam. That money could change your life. It could cover surgery, pay off debts, maybe even buy a house. But if you tell them, you're likely going to be thrown out. You're still living at home. And, to be real, I can't take you in if that happens. I live in a one-bedroom apartment, and I'm babysitting my younger brother twice a week. I just can't risk it." Sam was silent. I could hear him breathing on the other end, but his silence was loaded with emotion. I wasn't trying to hurt him. I cared deeply for Sam. But I'd always been pragmatic. Maybe too much so. To me, this was just a matter of laying out the options. However bluntly, I thought he'd take it in stride. But instead, he just burst into tears and hung up. Later that morning, my phone was flooded with texts. Sam called me a bad friend, a horrible person, even accused me of being transphobic. I was hurt. Sam knew me well enough to understand that I couldn't care less about someone's gender identity. My advice had been about security, about ensuring he had a safe, stable future. He'd come to me for advice, and I gave it, honest and unfiltered. That day, I didn't respond to his texts. I wasn't sure what to say, so I called my mom, who knew a bit about Sam's situation. She listened and told me that maybe Sam had already made up his mind to come out and was hoping for support, not advice. Maybe I'd been too blunt. She urged me to apologize, but I was torn. Apologies didn't come easily to me. especially if I didn't believe I'd done something wrong. A few days passed before I finally sent Sam an email. I explained that I stood by what I'd said, but I apologized if it had hurt him. I also told him that if he chose to come out, I'd support him, but that he should prepare himself first, get his documents in order, save up some money, make sure he had a safe place to go. I even included links to cheap apartments nearby and offered to help him financially for the first month. An hour after sending the email, Sam called, and I answered, hoping we could have a civil conversation. Instead, he exploded. He accused me of trying to control him, called me a robot, even suggested that I didn't care about him at all. The words cut deep, especially because he knew that I was on the autism spectrum and struggled with expressing emotions in ways others found normal. He mocked the apartment links I'd sent, calling them trashy, and then, in a final blow, said, "Why are you so worried about your brother? He isn't your kid, just forget about him." At that moment, I felt a shift in me. My brother, who had health issues and was immunocompromised, meant everything to me. For Sam to brush him off so casually felt like a slap in the face. I stayed quiet, barely able to process the anger and hurt I felt. The call ended, but the words lingered, and I was left wondering what had happened to the friendship I thought I knew. After that argument, I started replaying moments from our past. There were countless times when I dropped everything to support Sam. I'd left work events to pick him up when he was too drunk to get home safely. I'd skipped family events to be by his side when he felt down. And yet, when I'd needed him after a major eye surgery, he couldn't even be bothered to bring me my school assignments or take me to follow-up appointments. My sister, who'd never really liked Sam, reminded me of these things, urging me to see the ways in which he had taken me for granted. Eventually, Sam went ahead with his plan to come out, and as I had feared, he was cut off from his family. He moved out, bouncing from friend to friend, never really finding stability. In time, he lost his job and spiraled into a depression, reaching out to friends who grew weary of his constant demands. 2 years later, as I stood in line for coffee, I heard my name. I turned to see Sam, barely recognizable. His face was etched with lines of stress, his clothes disheveled. He sat down with me, unloading the hardships he'd faced since coming out, each word laced with anger. He blamed me for abandoning him, for not supporting him the way he thought a friend should. I listened, feeling a mixture of sympathy and frustration. When he finally paused, I told him, "I'm sorry for everything you went through. But I warned you. I offered help, just not in the way you wanted." He scoffed, accusing me of being heartless. I couldn't deny the truth in what I had said, but I also couldn't pretend to feel guilty for his choices. Sam had made his decision, knowing the risks. It wasn't my fault he had lost everything. He had chosen his path. As I left, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had loved Sam as a friend, but I realized that sometimes love meant letting go, setting boundaries, and refusing to enable harmful choices. It was painful, but I knew that I had done what I believed was right, even if it had cost me a friendship. Reflecting on it all, I learned that true friendship doesn't mean always agreeing or blindly supporting each other. Sometimes, it means being the voice of reason, even if it makes you the bad guy in someone else's story. It means being there for people but recognizing when their choices are taking a toll on your own well-being. And for Sam, I hope he learned that honesty with oneself must sometimes come with responsibility, a responsibility to prepare for the consequences, even when they're painful. In the end, this story isn't just about Sam and me. It's about the boundaries we set, the value we place on ourselves, and the lessons we learn when we choose to live authentically.